If you like our video, click the button to subscribe to our channel and get easy access to new content. To see our full suite of ad-free video courses, instruction manuals, and quick reference guides, visit us at www.teachucomp.com. Before you manually create a pivot table in Excel for Microsoft 365, first determine which data source to use for the pivot table. You can create a pivot table that uses a single table or cell range in Excel, an external data source, or Excel's data model. This determines which command you select to insert the blank pivot table. If you intend to use a single Excel table or cell range as the data source, then either click into the table to use as the data source, or click into the cell where you want to insert the upper left corner of the pivot table. Alternatively, if you intend to use an external data source or tables added to Excel's data model, then instead select the cell where you want to insert the upper left corner of the pivot table. To insert a pivot table in Excel that uses a single table or cell range in Excel as its data source, either click the Pivot Table button in the Tables button group on the Insert tab of the ribbon, or click the drop-down below this button and select the From Table/Range command. Performing either action then opens the Pivot Table from Table or Range dialog box. In this dialog box, first select or verify the Pivot Table's data source in the Select a Table or Range section. If you started by clicking into the table in the Excel worksheet to use as the data source, its table name or cell reference should appear in the Table/Range field. To manually select the table or range, if you instead selected the cell into which to place the pivot table, click the Collapse Expand dialog box button at the right end of the Table Range field to collapse the dialog box down to a single line. Then click and drag over the cell range or table to use as the data source for your pivot table. Then click the same Collapse Expand dialog box button again to expand the dialog box after selecting the data cells. Alternatively, to use a named table as your data source, type its name into the Table/Range field instead. Next, choose where to place the pivot table from the options in the Choose Where You Want the Pivot Table to be Placed section. If you selected the cell into which to insert the pivot table when you started this process, the Existing Worksheet option should appear selected, and the selected cell reference should appear in the Location field. To instead place the pivot table into a new Excel worksheet, select the New Worksheet option button. Alternatively, to select an existing worksheet cell if needed, select the Existing Worksheet option button. Then click the adjacent Collapse Expand dialog box button at the right end of the Location field to collapse the dialog box down to a single line. Then click the worksheet cell to set as the upper left corner of the pivot table. Then click the same button again to expand the dialog box when finished. If desired, to add the selected data to the Excel Workbook's data model, check the Add this data to the data model checkbox. When finished, click the OK button to create the pivot table. Alternatively, to insert a pivot table in Excel that uses an external data source, click the drop-down arrow below the Pivot Table button in the Tables button group on the Insert tab of the ribbon. Then select the From External Data Source command to open the pivot table from an external source dialog box. To then choose the external data source, click the Choose Connection button in this dialog box to open the Existing Connections dialog box. The Connections tab of the Existing Connections dialog box shows any available external data connections for this Excel workbook, your network, or your computer. To show all the data connections in your workbook, network, and computer in 3 separate sections, use the Show drop-down at the top of the Connections tab in the Existing Connections dialog box to select the All Connections choice. Then select the external data connection to use for your pivot table from the connections shown. Alternatively, to select to use the tables in the workbook's data model or a single Excel table from any opened Excel workbook as the pivot table's data source, click the Tables tab at the top of the existing Connections dialog box. Then select either an individual table from any opened Excel workbook, or select the Tables in Workbook Data Model choice to select all the tables in the data model. After making your data choice selection on either tab, then click the Open button to return to the Pivot Table from an external source dialog box. Then finish selecting the Pivot Table location as when inserting a pivot table from a single table as described earlier in this lesson, and click the OK button to finish and insert the pivot table. Alternatively, to insert a pivot table in Excel that uses the tables in the workbook's data model as its data source, click the drop-down arrow below the Pivot Table button in the Tables button group on the Insert tab of the ribbon. Then select the From Data Model command to open the Pivot Table from Data Model dialog box. Then finish selecting the pivot table location as when inserting a pivot table from a single table as described earlier in this lesson, and click the OK button to finish and insert the pivot table. After inserting a pivot table, the Pivot Table Fields task pane appears at the right side of the workbook. The large field at the top of the task pane shows the fields from the selected data source. It also shows the fields grouped by tables if you added multiple tables. If needed, to expand or collapse the fields in a table shown here, click the table's name. To add a field to the pivot table, check the checkbox next to its name here, or drag the field to the desired quadrant below. If you check a field, Excel adds it to either the Filters, Columns, Rows, or Values quadrant in the Drag Fields Between Areas Below section at the bottom of the task pane. To change the pivot table calculation or layout, click and drag the desired fields from one quadrant to another, depending on what you want to show in the pivot table. Excel calculates the data values of the fields placed into the Values quadrant using the Sum function by default. Remember to click the subscribe button to see more of our videos. See our full suite of courses, instruction manuals, and quick reference guides at www.teachucomp.com.